Captain Alexis Moore walked through the airport with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of experience she had earned in an industry that was still a challenge for women like her, even more so for black women. Her uniform was sharp and precise, the gold Admiral badge on her chest gleaming as she walked past the crowds of travelers, some of whom glanced at her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. It was a feeling Alexis was used to, though it never lost its impact. There was always that feeling of being different, yet proud of her place in the world she had built. She had worked hard to earn her position as one of the top pilots in the industry, and the Admiral badge was a symbol of that hard work, but also a reminder of the many battles she had fought along the way. No one gave her the title she had fought for every inch of it, from the moment she set foot in aviation school to the long hours spent in the cockpit navigating both the skies and the prejudice she sometimes faced on the ground. Her mind was set on the flight ahead, a chance to relax and recharge after months of demanding schedules. She had earned this break, and she was looking forward to it. As she approached the check-in counter, she flashed a friendly smile to the attendant who was busy scanning tickets. The woman behind the counter was young and appeared to be a bit flustered. She glanced up briefly when Alexis spoke her name, but then her eyes dropped quickly back to the computer screen. Alexis could sense something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the usual polite but neutral attitude she often encountered. It was something else, a hesitation. The attendant typed furiously on her keyboard for a few moments and then paused. Alexis could see the confusion in her face. The young woman looked at the screen, then at Alexis, then back to the screen, like something didn't quite add up. Alexis shifted her weight from one foot to the other, wondering what was taking so long. She had a flight to catch and was growing impatient, but she remained composed, a calm smile on her face. After a moment, the attendant looked up, her expression now more uncertain than before. She hesitated before speaking, her voice soft and unsure. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your boarding pass." Alexis blinked, surprised by the statement. She glanced at the ticket in her hand. Everything seemed fine to her. "What do you mean there's an issue?" Alexis asked, her voice steady, but a hint of concern creeping in. "I've checked it several times, and it's all correct." The attendant's eyes darted back to the computer screen, then she looked at Alexis again, clearly unsure of what to say. Alexis felt a twinge of unease. She could see the other passengers behind her beginning to glance at the interaction, noticing the delay, some growing impatient, some just curious. But the moment the attendant spoke again, that uneasy feeling turned into something more familiar, something Alexis had learned to identify over the years, a subtle dismissiveness, something that only those who had experienced it could truly recognize. "I'm afraid I can't let you board the flight just yet. There seems to be a discrepancy with your credentials," the attendant said, looking away awkwardly as she spoke, her words hanging in the air. Alexis could feel the weight of them settling around her like a heavy cloak. Alexis took a slow breath, trying to maintain her composure as the attendant's words lingered in the air. She could feel the eyes of the passengers behind her, some of them now openly watching the interaction. There was a brief moment of silence before Alexis spoke again, her voice calm but with a note of determination. "Discrepancy?" she asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "What discrepancy? I've been flying with this airline for years, and I've never had an issue with my credentials." The attendant, who now appeared even more flustered, fumbled with the boarding pass in her hands, her fingers tapping nervously against the counter. I'm not sure, ma'am," she stammered, glancing back and forth between Alexis and the computer screen. "I just can't seem to find any reason why the system is rejecting your boarding pass. Maybe it's a technical issue, but I'm going to need to call someone." Alex's patience was wearing thin, but she knew better than to lose her cool. She was a professional, and that meant staying in control. But there was something about the way the attendant was acting, distracted, almost dismissive, that was starting to feel wrong. Alexis had been in the industry long enough to recognize when something wasn't right, and this had nothing to do with a simple technical glitch. "Fine," Alexis said, folding her arms across her chest. "Call whoever you need to call, but I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved." The attendant nodded quickly, picking up the phone and speaking in a hushed tone, her eyes flickering nervously to Alexis. Alexis could hear her words, but they were too muffled to make out the details. She could feel the tension building, not just from the attendant, but from the people around her as well. It wasn't long before a supervisor arrived, a middle-aged man with a serious look on his face. He took one look at Alexis, then at the attendant, before asking what the issue was. "We have a problem with this passenger's boarding pass," the attendant explained, still unsure of what was going on. "The system won't let her through. There's some sort of discrepancy with her credentials, but I can't figure out what it is." The supervisor turned his attention to Alexis, his eyes scanning her outfit, her admiral badge, and her professional demeanor. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, I'll have to take a closer look at this." Alexis didn't say anything but stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for this to be over. She couldn't help but feel the growing frustration inside her, but she kept it contained. She'd seen this before, being questioned more thoroughly than others, being asked to prove her worth when others never had to. It wasn't the first time someone had second-guessed her authority, and it wasn't likely to be the last. A few minutes passed, and finally, the supervisor returned to the desk, his face more apologetic than before. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. It appears there was a mistake with the system. Your credentials are perfectly valid, of course," he said, his voice now smoother and more respectful. Alexis kept her expression neutral, but couldn't help feeling a small sense of satisfaction at the apology. She had been right to trust her instincts, but as she prepared to finally board, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play here than just a simple glitch in the system. The recognition in the supervisor's eyes when he saw her admiral badge spoke volumes. She'd been treated differently. Again. Without saying anything more, Alexis nodded curtly and moved toward the gate. The supervisor stepped aside, but she couldn't help but wonder how many others have been caught in a similar situation. How many others have been overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly, just because they didn't have the rank, the badge, or the position to prove they belonged. As Alexis made her way toward the gate, her thoughts churned. The brief interaction at the check-in counter was only a small part of a much larger issue, one that she had come to recognize as a subtle but persistent part of her daily life. She'd been in this industry long enough to know that respect didn't always come easily for women, especially Black women, no matter their rank or accomplishments. The boarding area was buzzing with activity. People huddled in small groups, chatting, scrolling through their phones, or sipping coffee. But despite the noise around her, Alexis felt a quiet heaviness in the pit of her stomach. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself that she had just made it through the moment, that the supervisor had cleared everything up and she was about to board the flight. Yet something gnawed at her. The lingering feeling of being underestimated was hard to ignore. As she approached the gate, she noticed a few of the passengers glancing in her direction. Some had the look of polite curiosity, while others seemed to study her with an air of surprise. Alexis was no stranger to being scrutinized. After all, being one of the few Black women in high-ranking aviation roles often made her a subject of fascination. But today felt different. There was an edge to it, as though her very presence was out of place. She couldn't help but wonder if the crowd was questioning how she had gotten this far. Was it because of the badge on her uniform, the gold insignia that symbolized her rank and years of dedication, or had they simply assumed she didn't belong? The unease was still there, but she kept moving forward, her posture straight, her face neutral. As she approached the gate, she overheard a conversation between two passengers seated nearby. One of them, a woman in a business suit, was speaking to her companion, her voice carrying just enough for Alexis to hear. "I can't believe they let her on the flight," the woman said, her tone dripping with thinly veiled judgment. "I thought only the elite got those admiral positions. And well, she doesn't exactly fit the profile, does she?" The words stung more than Alexis expected, and for a split second she faltered. She knew that these kinds of comments were far from rare, but hearing them in such a public setting, from a complete stranger, was a bitter reminder of the biases that still ran deep. But she didn't let it show. She kept walking toward the gate, her steps unhurried but deliberate. As she passed them, the conversation died down, but the damage had already been done. She wondered if the woman knew what it took to get to where Alexis was today, how many times she had fought against assumptions, stereotypes, and doubt. The path to becoming an admiral wasn't easy. It was paved with countless hours of hard work, a string of rejections, endless evaluations, and the constant need to prove herself worthy in ways that many of her colleagues never had to. Alexis had earned her place, but in that moment, she felt the weight of having to continually prove that fact to others. She had long accepted that her accomplishments would be questioned in ways that others wouldn't, but there were days when that truth felt heavier than others. Her thoughts were interrupted when her boarding group was called. Alexis took a deep breath, pushed aside the weight of the earlier encounter, and stepped forward. As she handed her boarding pass to the attendant, she couldn't help but notice the woman's expression, genuine surprise, almost like she was seeing Alexis for the first time. A small part of Alexis wanted to say something, to challenge the unspoken assumption that had lingered, but she knew better. This wasn't the time. Instead, she simply smiled and nodded and walked down the jet bridge, finally on her way to her seat. But as she settled into her seat on the plane, the same questions lingered in her mind. How many more people like her had faced this kind of treatment, this constant need to prove their worth just because of who they were? How many had given up along the way, their confidence chipped away by moments like this one? As the plane's engines roared to life and the aircraft taxied down the runway, Alexis leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The sound of the engines and the rush of air outside her window were strangely calming. For a brief second, she allowed herself to escape the frustration of the morning and the unsettling feeling that had lingered since the check encounter. She was finally airborne, far away from the doubt and dismissiveness she had encountered. But even at 30,000 feet, her mind kept returning to that moment of the counter. It was then that she noticed a tap on her shoulder. Alexis turned to see the same supervisor who had resolved her boarding issue standing in the aisle, his eyes wide with an expression of surprise. His presence was unexpected. She hadn't expected to see him again. "Excuse me, Captain Moore," he said quietly, his voice slightly hesitant. "I just wanted to personally apologize again for the inconvenience earlier. I'm really sorry for how things went down." Alexis gave him a polite but neutral smile. "It's all right. You did what you could," she replied, her voice steady. But inside, she could feel the edge of her earlier frustration creeping back. It wasn't the apology that bothered her. It was the fact that it was even needed in the first place. She had been perfectly composed throughout the whole situation, but she had been treated as though she wasn't supposed to be there. "I've worked here for over 20 years," the supervisor continued, "and I've seen my fair share of mistakes. But I have to admit, I'm surprised that something like this happened to you." He paused, almost as if searching for the right words. "You're someone we should be respecting, Captain. I know we missed that earlier." Alexis looked at him, her expression unreadable. She appreciated the apology, but it didn't erase the sting of what had happened. She'd been treated as an anomaly, as if her admiral status was somehow unexpected simply because of the way she looked. She took a deep breath, keeping her voice even. "I understand," she said slowly, "but this isn't just about today. It's about how people like me are often overlooked, dismissed, or doubted in this industry. I've worked harder than anyone to get here, and moments like this, well, they remind me that the work is never truly done. There's always someone who assumes I don't belong." The supervisor nodded slowly, his face a mix of understanding and regret. "I can't even begin to imagine what that's like," he said, "but I promise you, I'll make sure something like this never happens again." Alexis studied his face, trying to gauge whether his words were sincere. It wasn't enough to simply say the right things. She'd heard empty apologies before, but something in the way he looked at her, something in his eyes, told her that he wasn't just offering words for the sake of politeness. He understood. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter now. "It's not just about me. It's about making sure the system changes for everyone who walks through those doors, regardless of their background or appearance." The supervisor nodded, then turned and left her seat, returning to his duties. Alexis watched him go, her thoughts returning to the broader issue at hand. She couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. Disappointment that the apology had even been necessary, that such moments were still a part of her daily life, but there was also a sense of resolve in her heart. Alexis knew that her fight wasn't just hers alone. It was for every person of color, every woman, every underrepresented individual who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. She'd spent years pushing through the barriers that were placed in her way, but her role as an admiral wasn't just about her achievements. It was about opening doors for others, about making sure that they would have a chance to prove their worth without the added weight of bias. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Alexis knew that she would keep fighting for that change, even if it meant continuing to prove herself in ways others never would. The hum of the plane was a steady presence as it soared through the clouds, a small comfort amid the swirling thoughts in Alexis' mind. She had settled back into her seat after the conversation with the supervisor, but the lingering feeling of being underestimated still clung to her. Despite the supervisor's apology, the experience had left a bitter taste, reminding her of the persistent barriers that would never fully disappear. The system might have apologized, but the bias was still there, just beneath the surface, and it was something she would have to keep facing, whether she wanted to or not. She leaned back, allowing herself to relax for a moment, and glanced around the cabin. There were a few familiar faces, colleagues she recognized, other passengers settling in for the flight. Alexis was used to being surrounded by strangers, but today it felt different. It felt like she was once again fighting an invisible battle that no one else could see. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out, expecting a message from her sister or a quick work-related email, but instead she saw a text from one of her closest colleagues, Captain Eva Davis. They'd known each other for years, working together on several international flights, and having each other's backs in moments when the weight of being one of the few women in aviation felt like too much. Asterisk Eva. How's it going? Everything okay with the flight? Asterisk. Alexis smiled at the message, thankful for the distraction. She quickly typed back. Asterisk Alexis. Just landed. But you know, today's been a reminder of why we have to keep pushing. It's not always about the job. It's about breaking barriers for everyone who comes after us. Asterisk. Asterisk Eva. I hear you. Same thing happened to me last month on a layover. Just keep doing your thing. They can't stop us. Asterisk. Alexis paused for a moment before typing a response. Asterisk Alexis. Yeah, but sometimes it gets exhausting. It's like you keep having to prove you belong, even when you've earned your place 1,000 times over. Asterisk. She stared at the message for a moment, rereading it. It felt like she was sharing something personal, something that only someone who understood could relate to. Eva's response came a few moments later. Asterisk Eva. I'd get it, but you're a trailblazer, Alexis. You've broken down so many walls already, and you're gonna keep breaking more. This industry isn't ready for the change we're bringing, but they'll have to deal with it. Just keep being you. The rest will follow. Asterisk. Alexis smiled, a little lighter after reading her friend's words. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone in this fight. There were other women, other people of color, who were pushing through the same challenges, and they were doing it with strength, determination, and grace. But as she sat there reflecting, Alexis knew that the path ahead was still long. Even though the apology from the supervisor had been genuine, the incident at the counter was just one of many microaggressions she'd encountered in her career. It was the little things, the doubts, the assumptions, the looks that said, "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" that made every day feel like a battle. She thought about how much she had sacrificed to get where she was, how many hours of training, how many sleepless nights, how many moments when she had to put aside her own exhaustion just to prove that she belonged. The Admiral badge wasn't just a symbol of her rank, it was a symbol of everything she had overcome to get there. And yet, despite all of that, there was always someone who would make her question whether her place in the sky was truly hers to claim. But Alexis wouldn't let that stop her. She couldn't. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds pass by, her resolve strengthening with every passing moment. She had fought for this. She had earned this. And no one was going to take that from her. The plane continued its smooth flight through the clouds, and Alexis found herself lost in the rhythm of the journey. The soft murmurs of conversation from the surrounding passengers faded into the background as she gazed out of the window, the vast sky stretching endlessly before her. Yet the weight of the day still lingered on her shoulders. Despite the comfort of being in the air, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this flight, would always be connected to the encounter at the airport. Her thoughts turned once again to the supervisor's apology. Though it had been sincere, Alexis couldn't help but think how often these apologies felt like a mere formality. How many times had she been apologized to by those who didn't fully understand the weight of their actions? Sure, the system was acknowledging its mistakes, but the changes she needed to see were still far from being implemented. A brief apology wasn't enough to undo years of bias and discrimination embedded in an industry that often treated women of color as anomalies rather than as equals. She could feel a familiar resolve building inside her. The momentary frustration she'd experienced at the counter had sparked something deep within her, a renewed determination. She wasn't just fighting for her own place in this world. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. Every flight, every encounter, every moment of her career was a chance to break another barrier, to make it a little easier for the next person to walk into that same space and not feel out of place. As her thoughts swirled, Alexis was pulled from her reverie by the gentle ping of the seatbelt sign coming on. The captain's voice crackled through the overhead speakers, announcing that they were beginning their descent into their destination. It was a smooth landing, and Alexis appreciated the steadiness of the plane's descent. It was the kind of precision that reflected her own approach to her career. Every move, every decision had to be calculated and sure. There was no room for error. The plane touched down gently, and Alexis felt her body relax slightly as the wheels met the tarmac. She unbuckled her seatbelt and gathered her things, her mind still buzzing with the complexities of her profession. It wasn't just about flying. It was about navigating the skies and the biases below, about performing at the highest level in a world that wasn't always ready to see her as an equal. As she walked down the aisle and toward the exit, Alexis couldn't help but notice the looks she received from some of the other passengers. Some of them nodded, others smiled, but there were still a few who couldn't quite mask their surprise. It was always the same. The silent moment when people took in her uniform, her gold admiral badge, and processed the incongruity of seeing a black woman in such a position. For some, it was a moment of recognition, of respect. For others, it was a moment of doubt. Did she truly belong? The questions, though unspoken, were there, and Alexis had long since learned to carry them with quiet grace. She stepped out into the terminal and felt the weight of the day lifting just a little. She was on the ground again, but it wasn't over. It would never truly be over. The work, the fight for equality and respect, would continue. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, a brief respite before the next challenge. She knew that no matter what the world threw at her, she would keep moving forward, because that was what she had always done, and she wasn't about to stop now. As Alexis walked through the bustling terminal, the noise and movement around her felt almost surreal after the quiet of the sky. She passed through security, heading toward the baggage claim area where she was due to meet a few colleagues. The day's events replayed in her mind, every conversation, every glance, every moment when she'd felt that undercurrent of doubt, whether from the supervisor, the passengers, or even herself. It was exhausting, this constant need to prove herself, but it was also a reality she had come to accept. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a message from another colleague, Captain Marcus Hayes. They'd been working together for years and had become close friends, both navigating the turbulent waters of an industry that often didn't understand them. Asterisk Marcus. Long day? You good? Asterisk. Alexis smiled, appreciating the simple check-in. She typed back quickly. Asterisk Alexis. Same old, same old. Just another reminder that being a woman of color in aviation requires a bit more proving than it should. Asterisk. The reply came almost immediately. Asterisk Marcus. Ooh, don't I know it? It's ridiculous that you've got to work harder just to get the same respect, but you're killing it out there. We all see it asterisk. Alexis paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. She thought about what he said. Asterisk asterisk we all see it asterisk asterisk in some ways, that was the only recognition she needed. It wasn't about the approval of strangers or even the occasional apology from a well-meaning supervisor. It was about the people who truly understood what it took to get there, the people who were walking the same path, fighting the same fight. She replied with a simple asterisk thanks Marcus. Means a lot asterisk. The message didn't take away the sting of the earlier moments, but it helped. It reminded her that not everyone saw her as an anomaly. There were those who recognized her strength, who saw the work behind the badge, and who knew that she had earned every ounce of respect she received. It was moments like these, small, simple gestures of understanding, that kept her going. She reached the baggage claim area and spotted her colleagues, a few fellow captains who had been on different flights, but were now back in town for a brief layover. As they greeted her with smiles and handshakes, Alexis couldn't help but feel a sense of solidarity. Here, among these people, there was no questioning her place. Here, she didn't have to prove herself. They knew her. They respected her. "Hey, Alexis," Captain Derek Green said, his voice cheerful as he pulled his suitcase off the conveyor belt. "You flying solo today, or you got a crew with you?" "Solo," Alexis replied with a grin, "but it feels good to be back in familiar territory." Derek nodded. "Yeah, I know what you mean. I swear sometimes it's like we have to work twice as hard just to get the same treatment. It's getting old." Alexis didn't need to say much. Derek's words spoke volumes, as did the understanding in his eyes. They had both encountered those silent judgments, those subtle biases that people thought they could hide behind polite smiles. It wasn't just about flying a plane or doing a job. It was about doing it while fighting an invisible war. As they gathered their bags and prepared to head to the crew hotel, Alexis reflected on the moments that had led to this point. Every flight, every interaction, every challenge she faced was part of the larger story of breaking barriers. She wasn't just an admiral, a black woman in a role that many thought was beyond her reach. She was a symbol of what could happen when resilience and talent collided with opportunity. Her journey was far from over, but with each step, she was making the skies a little less foreign for those who would follow her. And that, more than anything else, was enough to keep her pushing forward. The crew hotel was a familiar comfort, a place where the constant travel and long hours of work could momentarily give way to rest. As Alexis entered her room, she placed her bag on the bed, the soft sigh of relief escaping her lips as she let the tension of the day finally begin to dissipate. The warmth of the room, the soft hum of the HVAC system, and the promise of a quiet night gave her a brief but much-needed respite. She sat down on the bed and reflected on the events of the day. It had been a whirlwind, but the emotions that swirled within her were a constant companion. The frustration, the anger, and the exhaustion were all valid, but there was something else too. Something deeper, a feeling of resolve, of purpose. Every time she faced those moments of doubt and discrimination, she learned to channel them into something greater than herself. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Eva, her friend and fellow captain. Asterisk Eva. Just wanted to check in. You holding up okay? Asterisk. Alexis smiled, grateful for the thoughtful message. Eva had always been someone who understood exactly what she was going through. It was rare to find people who could truly grasp the weight of what it meant to be a woman of color in aviation, but Eva had been with her through thick and thin. Asterisk Alexis. I'm good, just taking a minute to breathe. Same old fight, you know. But I'm doing it. We're doing it asterisk. Asterisk Eva. We are, and you're not alone in this. You keep breaking down those walls, and I see it. I know others do too. Don't let the small stuff get to you asterisk. Alexis paused before typing a response. Eva's words were like a balm to a wound that never quite healed, no matter how many victories she had. Every moment of doubt and every microaggression added up, but having a friend who truly understood made it a little more bearable. Asterisk Alexis. Thanks, Eva. I needed that asterisk. As Alexis set her phone down, she looked out the window at the city skyline beyond, her mind wandering back to her journey, the long road that had led her to this point. She'd always dreamed of flying, but she had never imagined the weight that would come with it. She had been told countless times that the sky was the limit, but the path to breaking through the clouds was paved with obstacles, prejudice, and skepticism. Yet she had never stopped. She couldn't afford to. Too many others had paved the way for her, and now it was her turn to make sure the next generation had the same opportunities. She thought about the passengers on that last flight, the ones who had given her those questioning glances when she passed them by. They hadn't known her story, but she knew theirs. They were part of the system that reinforced biases, that viewed her as an anomaly rather than as someone who had earned her place. But one day that would change. One day, the sight of a black woman in an admiral uniform wouldn't surprise anyone. It would just be another part of the norm. The path was long, and it would take time, but Alexis was determined to see that day. The sound of the knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She stood up and opened it to find Derek and Marcus standing in the hallway, grinning. "We're headed to the hotel bar," Marcus said. "You coming?" Alexis smiled, feeling the camaraderie of her colleagues surround her. "Definitely," she replied. "Let's go." As they walked down the hallway together, Alexis felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, and it would never be easy. But she had allies, friends, mentors, and colleagues who supported her. And every step she took, every day she spent in the skies, was another victory in a long battle. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they couldn't be more. She was fighting for the future. And with that, Alexis stepped into the night, ready for whatever came next.